In this second clip, you'll learn how to mend a sock that already has a hole in it. Push the darning mushroom into the sock, just underneath the hole, and secure the sock to the mushroom by tying a band or a piece of string underneath the hat of the mushroom. This is for holding the sock in place while you're darning, since it's easier to handle when nothing is moving around uncontrollably. Take a piece of yarn that is close to the thickness your socks have been knit with. Thread the tapestry needle and push the needle into the sock, some 5 centimeters from the edge of the hole you'll be covering. Pull the needle and yarn to the front, close to the edge of the hole, and leave a tail for weaving in later. Remember to do this every time you begin darning with a new yarn. You'll see this later on when we run out of yarn. Sew a row of running stitches around the hole just to secure the broken surface around the opening. The purpose of the running stitch in this case is for holding the knit together so that the edges of the hole doesn't stretch. The running stitch is probably the most basic stitch in hand sewing because it's useful for so many different projects, from joining layers of fabric together to making decorative projects with different shapes and colors. Load the stitches onto the needle, about 3 at a time, depending on where you are in the mend and how long your needle is. How many is up to you. There's no rule for this. Pull the needle through. Repeat until you've reached all the way back to where you started. Start sewing blanket stitches around the hole. This mend requires for a little more closer stitches than in the first clip, as you will have to cover the hole completely and you don't want any gap to be seen through the mend. Continue sewing a full circle around the gap. Maybe I should mention that if your socks has ends and bits of yarn around the holes and looks a bit messy, it would be good to clean the edges with scissors by cutting off all loose and broken yarn ends before you start mending. Let's speed up this video a bit. When you reach the first blanket stitch made in the beginning, push the needle into the previous stitch on the row below. There's no surface or knit stitches on the sock underneath, so it's quite obvious that you have to make new stitches into the earlier made ones on previous rows. Sew a new stitch into every stitch underneath. Sew them in a spiral to the very end of your mend. Continue sewing until you run out of yarn, and when you do, push the needle into the mending and out through the sock on the side. Leave a few centimeters between the mend and where you push out the needle to the front. The yarn chosen to mend with in this clip has been dyed with plants, and choosing different shades in every new piece of yarn will make the mend look very interesting. Take a new piece of yarn, rethread the needle and push the needle into the sock at some distance from the mend and out exactly where you left your last made stitch. Remember to always leave a tail of yarn to be woven in later, just like you did when you started. Continue as before by sewing all the way around in a spiral. If the yarn gets tangled up, and as I mentioned before, it really does and sometimes quite often, let go of the needle and yarn and hang it from the sock or untangle it by hand, stretching the yarn by pulling on it. When the gap in the sock gets smaller, you will have to reduce the number of stitches on each row in order to keep the stitches flat as you work towards the center. Reducing the stitches is quite easy. You just jump over a stitch underneath and continue sewing into the next one. The more you get to the center of the mend, you'll probably have to jump over every other stitch to still keep the work flat. Continue like this until the gap is totally covered and you're satisfied with your mending. Remember that it's always possible to unravel the stitching if your mend looks bulky, which would mean that you have too many stitches in the mend and too close to the other. We don't have footage on unraveling darned mending, but if you would need to unravel stitches, first remove the needle from the yarn and with your needle pull on the blanket stitches one by one until you reach the part that still stays flat. Rethread the needle and continue. So, when you're finished mending, loosen the string around the foot of the mushroom, remove it and the string, and turn the sock over and start cleaning up all loose ends of yarn. Weave in the tail of the yarn by sewing into the backs of the stitches and into the edge of the gap. There are different ways to weave in tails of yarn when you're finished working. Either sew into the backs of the blanket stitches or into the side of the sock edge. Cut off the end of the yarn. The mend looks really nice and flat, and you can see the different shades of the plant dyed yarn. Catch the yarn from all of the beginnings by pulling on the threads and pull them to the inside of the sock. You'll see where they are as you left long stitches beside the mend every time you changed yarn. The ends will be woven in later. Turn your sock back so you can see the front and the finished shape. Steam the patch for a neat finish, and you're done.